Welcome back to another episode of Make It Make Sense with Tomee Sojourner Campbell. In today's episode, Leading Through Change, Unlearn, Transform, and Reimagine. This is a particularly timely topic. A lot of organizations and businesses are looking at their diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility programs. Some of their programs go by different names, but basically trying to understand how they can provide more equitable environments for folks who are from historically marginalized communities and the struggles that are going on either politically or in-house. So it really is about some tips, but also questions, guiding questions as you look to apply a different lens. So if you're listening to this podcast and you are a manager or you're a president of an organization, you're a board member working on governance and operational issues, you're the chief executive officer, and you're simply trying to understand, there's been, political movements at foot. What do we do to ensure that we are addressing our legal obligations, but also that we have an ethical responsive and a social responsibility to the communities that we're a part of and the people that come and invest their time as our employees. So for you and for those individuals who are interested in these conversations and these change-making conversations and actions, I would say a few things. There are 5 leadership tips that I have when you're leading through organizational change. It starts with integrity. The integrity of being intentional about demonstrating how you lead with from a place of honesty and showing a consistent commitment and actions through ethical principles. When you tell a group of individuals that they are welcome in to your space as service users or as employees, and that you're going to work with them to ensure that barriers are removed and that there are swift actions when discriminatory practices happen. That means you're committing, from my perspective, you're committing to a process, an intentional process of learning to figure out how to do this work well, transforming the organization from the inside out to provide the spaces necessary to provide the resources, the operational resources, the governance policies and procedures to make those changes for each person in your organization, but for the organization and the communities that you work in. I think is also vital when you're looking at the types of approaches that you use, whether it's a human rights and equity approach, an anti-racism, anti-corruption approach, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, and considering all of those pieces, is that the actions that you follow will be scrutinized by so many, and that it is important to create processes in place so that you can map out how those changes happen. And I think it's important that however you make those changes in the organization, that it is clear for the reasons why. It's not simply stripping away DEI and closing offices and firing individuals and then simply saying, but we still want your business. We still want you to be employed here and to take us seriously, that we value you. I think that there are steps in place that if you're not doing DEI, then what are you doing to actually ensure that systemic discrimination, individual forms and institutional forms of discrimination are actually going to be changed? The second leadership tip I would say is to really consider the issue of the use of discretion. With some of the clients and work that I've done in the past, I've certainly had conversations about what does it mean to be a decision maker. And when you have use of discretion and don't apply an sort of equity lens to it and don't really intentionally look at how you use discretion, it can come to a place where there are a number of ways where perhaps unconsciously, and in some cases consciously, folks are giving opportunities for growth, career development, advancement to individuals they may feel more comfortable with, somebody who may be from a similar community or background, maybe a younger version of themselves, and they see that this person has a lot of potential and will be the right fit. And so what happens to everybody else who does not fit that mold, and how do you move them to from the periphery of your discretion, and thinking about discretion to the center of how you allocate resources and time and opportunity. So I'd ask you this, as leaders, if you're a leader, are leaders providing opportunities for growth, for staff, for management, for those members who are in the board who might be in junior positions but are interested in making moves forward? Are there lateral promotions? Are you able to, if your organization, your firm, your union does a lot of transformative work that really has an impact on society, when you're co-work, you're writing articles and thought leadership, we are providing opportunities where there's co-writing, co-publishing of articles, uh, co-publishing of podcasts and videos and other types of media and communication that allows for individuals who are from very historically marginalized communities an opportunity to showcase their work, to showcase their expertise and what they bring to the table. So I think it's also important to think about who represents your business or your organization, or if you're a union, who is put out in front of communities of members to have these conversations. And if you look around, or if you get a sense of the people in the room, sometimes the commitment on paper is there, but in reality, it's not. It's just sort of the similar faces, similar experiences, even though they may be a newer version of the people that are coming in. They may be new to the conversation in terms of the table that you've invited them to, but their views reflect sort of the existing quote unquote traditional way of doing things. And so I would also think about a third tip, which is really important. And this has been, something that I've thought about deeply over the last several decades, but more so as I've matured in my own practice as a consultant and thinking through when I go into client spaces and we've got several people at the table having these conversations around organizational change, operational change, and who gets credit. And quite often it's the leader whose portfolio it is will get the credit for all the work that's being done behind the scenes by the employees, by the staff that have been allocated or tasked to do the research, write up the proposals, write up the speaking notes, and brainstorm the ideas. It might be clients or customers who are asked to fill out a survey, provide their ideas at the table, and then at the end of the day, once you've created a product, you've created an article, created a policy and procedure or an initiative, those very same voices, particularly when they're from communities that are historically marginalized, their contributions are often rendered invisible. And that might be intentional or unintentional. And so leading through change really requires any decision maker to purposely name those individuals, unless they've asked it for their names, asked for you not to mention their names, and there's commitments to confidentiality, et cetera. But if that is not the case and you don't have those provisions in place, I would say naming the individuals, their positions, their contributions, and ensuring that you're amplifying the work and the voice that they have brought forward in order to change what's happening or to further develop and nurture the existing business, the existing organization. It's vital. Often the work that goes uncredited means that individuals may be missing opportunities for career advancement because nobody knows except the people in the room, whether virtually or in person, that this person has made a contribution. And beyond just a simple contribution, they're providing the feedback that's necessary to create transformative spaces and transformative policies and procedures and practices and initiatives. And so honoring their contributions by naming them and allowing for that process to happen and elevating their role, their position, and putting that, in a public facing document, putting that on a website and listing all of those contributions and attributions. I think it's key and something that I sadly don't see very often in large organizations. And I hope that that is going to change over time. Another thing that I consider to be important when we talk about leading through change or leading change is around decision making. And this is a hard one because obviously, as leaders, they're selected for a number of different reasons, to be their qualifications, years of professional development, years of um, being able to contribute to their industry and seen as change makers, change leaders. And when we think about leadership, decision making, and power and privilege, I'm drawn to a couple of key things. As leaders make decisions, it's so important to think about the clarity of how and whose knowledge and insights and expertise and experiences are considered and factored in to the decision-making process at all levels of the organization. Whether you're a business that provides retail services, hospitality, you're a sporting organization, you're a union, you're a law firm, an educational institution, when you think of governance and operations, how are your decisions made? Who do you factor in and who's excluded and put on the periphery? Unless there's a crisis and then that's something different. And then that individual, particularly if they're from historically marginalized communities, may be considered. But oftentimes that is a reaction to something that has happened, whether it's a reaction to a call for change to intentionally address anti-Black racism, but those before those calls to action were made, then those individuals and the experiences and contributions that they have made to the organization are not considered. So I really think that it's not about separating out, okay, I'm going to have, as a leader, a reactive response to something that comes down the pipe and I have to respond to a systemic discrimination allegation. So therefore, I'm going to now take these actions and center this particular group for a short period of time and invest a few dollars and some energy. And then when the call to action has subsided, then move on to the regular business at hand. And so leading through change with integrity, with intention, means that it's always top of mind when you're talking about an employee, when you're talking about a client or a guest, which groups, identifying the groups clearly and saying, how does my decision or the decision of this organization impact Indigenous, Black, racialized, historically marginalized members, community members, employees, and then understanding that when we're talking about historically marginalized groups, we're not talking about homogenous groups of individuals, and taking into consideration the nuances that exist within all communities and what needs to be considered, particularly by knowing what are some of the key issues that are happening in the broader society at the time, but what it's also been identified as historical barriers through anecdotal evidence, through looking at case law, through understanding what communities are saying, through their activism and their advocacy. It's also important when you're thinking about decision making, you know, integrating in some guiding questions. What is belonging? If that's a process that you're using to create an environment that people are going to be welcome into, and the foundations of change that you want to ensure that the individuals who you have hired or your organization has hired are able to work and thrive in that space. If the question of what does belonging actually look and feel like for the people who make up the organization or business, then the work is unpacking what belonging means and sort of drilling it down to its movable parts and then sort of rebuilding from there. And clearly identifying and putting an action plan and an implementation plan in place for each part that's been broken down and things that need to be considered. Lastly, I would say the fifth key tip around leading change is really thinking about respect and dignity. So how do you intentionally consider the experiences, the time, expertise, and knowledge of your peers, your colleagues, your people who directly report to you, of your clients, of guests, of consultants, and people you welcome into your space to share their expertise? Is there a way that you demonstrate as a leader respect and dignity? And I think sometimes we don't have common understandings of what respect and dignity are. I've certainly been at tables where there are conversations where everyone's like, yes, we want to ensure that the employees' respect and dignity are something that's considered. But then I ask the question, how do we define respect? I might have a very different definition of respect and dignity than the person next to me who holds more institutional power and more social capital. And so it doesn't mean the same thing. You can go to the Merriam-Webster definition of respect and of dignity, but I'm talking about what it means in the heart of the person and the experience of the person, especially when they have come from perhaps lived experiences where they have not been treated with respect and dignity. Some of the questions I would say, if you're listening to this podcast again as a leader, to think about, how do you show up at meetings and lead the meetings that are led by professionals from historically marginalized groups? So as an example, if you're showing up at a training, or if you're showing up at a leadership development opportunity, and the person in front of you is not someone you would normally listen to, what are some of the conscious and subtle ways in which you disengage from the process? And this is some of the things that I talk to my clients about. When you are in a room that is being led by a person that you value, and you value their input and their expertise, what do you look for? What do you do? It's been my observation professionally. I see people will put their phones down, put their laptops down if that's the case, or they will listen intently with whatever senses they are able to. If they have different forms of accommodation, they will signal through different types of body language that they're engaged. What I've also witnessed is that when individuals come to speak, it's their turn to speak, to provide their expertise, there may be distractions that happen where an individual may not see that person's contribution to the meeting or to the development opportunity as important as the person who spoke before them, or perhaps the person who's going to speak after them. And so there is texting, there's distraction, looking at the phones, perhaps getting up to walk around, or leaving the space, disengagement. I've seen a whole spectrum of different behaviors, or especially if it's something that's quite challenging, and it might touch on an experience, or it might be covering issues like systemic discrimination, some equitable distribution of opportunities. And when people are challenged, I know for myself, it can be very difficult to stay present and to listen. But I do notice it with some leaders where they will end up going to have side conversations and are really not listening and engaged, stop note taking. And then if the speaker engages them in a conversation, they either get quite defensive, or they're just not able to participate in the conversation because they have not been listening and paying attention. So I think it's important, when you talk about respect and dignity as a leader, is to consider, how do you show up in those spaces? If you are at a meeting and you're not able to be present, or you are, simply unable to show up for a number of different reasons, you may have meetings or other things on the go, it is very telling when you're a no-show as a leader, but do not communicate that with the people leading the meeting or the training. I think it's important to consider how you check in and check out, because it can symbolize a lack of respect. Because if you're leading by example, others are watching you. So if you check out, why should they stay and be present and take actions and implement changes when you're not willing to do the work yourself? And so I think it's crucial to have these conversations with yourself. And so some of the methods that you can do that is that self-reflective practice. Sit down and actually think of a time that you're at a presentation by someone who would not, quote unquote, normally be there presenting expertise to you. How did you respond to their work? How did you respond to them? What was going on? Were you feeling distracted? Were you feeling unsure? Did you not believe that they were competent? Because some of that, when you do those self-reflective practices and you take notes and you look back at how you responded, whether through body language, through your contributions, through the time that you invested in the materials that they provided to you. Did you read them? Did you integrate them into your own leadership practice? It can help you demonstrate where your biases might lie, unconscious and conscious. And I think with unconscious bias, which is a hot topic that's going on right now and has been for a number of decades in communities and in businesses, if you're thinking about your biases, sometimes we'll have unconscious bias and we move that into conscious practices. So it's important to create a process for yourself to shift through how you do things, are your practices, and how you can make changes to those practices in order to do something different. So it really is about engaging in a process of unlearning, relearning, transforming, and then reimagining how you can lead through example, not through performativity. And I think that although we're coming to the end of this particular podcast, it's going to be really important for you to consider, am I performing? And only you will know. Am I performing my commitment to anti-racism, anti-oppression, to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility? Does it fundamentally mean anything to me as an individual, as a leader of an organization, whether you're leading one extra person or you're leading 10,000 or 100,000 or a million and beyond? What is it I'm committing to? How do I lead? Through example, what are my actions and what are the processes that I'm taking and putting in place in order to be accountable, responsible, and have an opportunity to do a knowledge exchange with myself and others. Because I think when leaders don't do these practices and don't engage in the kind of change making, personal change making and professional change making, then when they are confronted by people, whether it's customers being disengaged, employees being disengaged, and not trusting them, there's a reason why. There's a lack of trust. And so we need to get to that, not necessarily from a place of being punitive, but a place of learning and a place of growing and changing, so that we can come to this with care. So until next time, I would love to hear from you. I have been hearing some feedback, so I appreciate that. This is an opportunity. I think there's a lot of opportunity to have guests on this show. I'd love to have some folks on and we can have a conversation about issues and topics, particularly about the workplace or service access or delivery and timely issues that are coming up for you and your communities. As a program that's listened to across North America and in different parts of the world, again, I thankful and appreciate you taking the time to listen. And you can always contact me at info@tomeesojourner.com. I look forward to your feedback. Until next time, thank you for listening to Make It Make Sense with Tomee Sojourner Campbell.